Hello and welcome. My name is Kevin Featherstone and I'm Director of the Hellenic Observatory here in the European Institute at the LSE. Today we're discussing the left in power, and our focus is on the left-wing government in Greece between 2015 and 2019. Our guest was at the very heart of that government. Euclid Tsakalotos was a minister and then finance minister in the Syriza governments. As such, he oversaw the Greek negotiations with his Eurozone counterparts in very difficult circumstances. Greece had suffered an unprecedented blow in the euro crisis. It lost over 25% of its GDP. Unemployment soared. About 1 in 4 Greeks were jobless, including almost 1 in 3 young people. The number of firms going bankrupt reached new heights. When Syriza came to power in January 2015, it did so with a campaign to stop austerity, to stop the monitoring of the Troika, but to stay in the Eurozone. Enough was enough. Its colourful finance minister, Yanis Varoufakis, led the challenge in Europe. Varoufakis was later sidelined by the Syriza government when the talks in the Eurozone seemed to be getting nowhere. In his place came Euclid Tsakalotos. As such, Euclid oversaw the transition from opposing any new Greek bailout to negotiating and implementing a third bailout. So what does the experience of Syriza suggest for the left in Europe? What does it tell us about democratic choice within the Eurozone, or about European solidarity? Critics blame Syriza for propagating populist illusions, making impossible demands that could not be met within the Eurozone. They see Syriza's version of a historic compromise as a kolotumba, a somersault. We have much to explore here. And Euclid is well used to the UK and has many friends in Britain. He studied PPE in Oxford, where he also obtained his PhD in economics. He taught at the University of Kent before returning to Greece and becoming a professor of economics at the Athens University of Economics and Business, and more recently at the University of Athens. To get us started, Euclid will make some opening comments for about 20 minutes or so. We'll then have a discussion and we'll open up the forum for your questions for those of you watching. For those of you watching this Zoom broadcast, then please send us your questions at any time using the Q&A facility at the bottom of your screen. Alternatively, if you're watching us now on Facebook for the live stream, then please send us the questions using the comment function. As the discussion proceeds, we encourage you to share your comments with us on Twitter. And the Twitter hashtag we suggest is #LSE Greece. And we look forward to receiving your comments and your questions, indeed, at any time. As you send us your questions, can I please ask you to tell us who you are, but please keep the questions short. It will enable us to get through as many questions as possible. And I promise you that when I'm reading the questions on the screen, it's a lot easier if I'm reading 2 sentences rather than your magnum opus. So please keep the questions short. Let me point out that the discussion is being recorded and will hopefully be made available as a podcast later. You'll be able to download that podcast from the website of the Hellenic Observatory here at the LSE, or you'll be able to watch it using the Hellenic Observatory's YouTube channel later. So let's begin. And let me extend a very warm welcome back to my friend, Euclid Tsakalotos. Euclid, you're very welcome. And I know that you and I have known each other for many years. We haven't always agreed 100%, but we certainly have much friendship and professional respect. You're very welcome. We look forward to your comments. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Kevin, for the invitation to have a talk and discuss the issues of the left in power. It's a shame we can't do it live and to be able to see old friends and discuss it, but it is what it is, and hopefully things will be improve for both our countries over the next few months. I should begin with a health warning. I've only just had my first jab, the AstraZeneca vaccine, an hour ago, and I don't know about side effects, but I remind you, Kevin, of your promise that if I start complimenting the New Democracy government for doing a wonderful job during this pandemic, you'll bring the proceedings to a swift close, that it won't be really me speaking. So let me just share the slides that I've prepared. This is obviously the title, The Left in Power, and let's go to I have to press a button. Where is it?
F5, I think, FTV.
Right, F5. Sorry about this. Okay, are we okay now? I think so. So that is the opening slide, the title, and let's begin. So I tried to divide it in the time available between the first term, which lasted from our win in the elections in January 2015 till basically the September 2015 election. The first term, I wasn't finance minister. I was a minister at the Foreign Office responsible for international economic affairs. And as Kevin said in his own introduction, things were very, very dire when we took over. He mentioned all the figures about the loss of 24% of GDP. I should say as a footnote, that is the greatest loss of any economy since records began in peacetime. And the unemployment was 25%. We had a humanitarian crisis, which extended not just to the people we usually call socially excluded, but to many working class and middle class people. We had a crisis of political representation, as the two major parties that had dominated Greek politics since 1974, the restoration of democracy, had been seen not only to have bankrupted Greece in 2009, but also had implemented 2 structural adjustment programs with the economic effects. I should add to what Kevin said that we also had the rise of the Golden Dawn, which became the third party in 2012, and that was a very serious challenge of what could go very seriously wrong if we didn't manage to do something. And we also had a great in many ways an exhausted population that had suffered economically and socially. They had actually been quite active politically. They had tried demonstrations, general strikes, one-issue activism about expensive travel, or about housings being reacquisitioned. We have the phenomenon of the squares. Maybe we can discuss that later in the talk. And so really Syriza was seen by very many people as the last chance. Now, the internal situation was not only the economic and social background that I've just described, but the legacy of the previous government. The strategy of the New Democracy PASOK government by the summer of 2014 was, in my view, utterly cynical. By the summer of 2014, they realized that in the election of November 2015, that was the last point when election could be had, there was no way they would win it. So their strategy was to what they called a left interval, that they would set a set of minds to make the next government, the government of the left that was obviously coming, as difficult as possible. So they didn't finish the review of the structural adjustment program. It was the 5th review. All structural adjustment programs have review that the institutions come and check that you've done this and that and the other. They didn't do that, so we had empty state coffers, we had an unsustainable debt, and faced for 2015 a huge repayment schedule. And we only had, after winning at the end of January 2015 the election, 1 month before the program expired. To show the degree of cynicism, they were offered, the previous government, a 5-month extension, but only opted for a 2-month extension, exactly to make it difficult. So by the summer of 2015, they essentially did not negotiate seriously with institutions, and what their strategy was to make things as difficult for the oncoming government. I think it's one of the most cynical pages in the history of Greek politics since the revolution, which was actually 200 years ago. We're celebrating the 200 years of the Greek War of Independence. Now, the external situation, so the last point about the internal situation was that we had a very hostile opposition. And this may be an interest to people who follow the LSE, a very hostile press, which actually led the opposition to the Syriza government throughout the period. I write here the Latin Americanization of the press, because in a number of other left-wing strategies, to put it into context, whether in Venezuela or Bolivia and other Latin American countries, a very hostile populist press has led the opposition to progressive politics. The external situation was not much better in 2015. One of the things we could also discuss, Kevin, was how different the world was in 2009 to 2015 at the European level from what it is now. Austerity was the only game in town. You will remember that the ECB's response in 2009 and 10 to the financial crisis was actually to increase interest rates. There really was no dent in the neoliberal hegemony about economics. There was no recognition of what I call the Keynes problem of symmetric adjustment. This is the Keynes argument in the early post-war period, that if only countries with a deficit on the current account adjust by reducing wages and having a fiscal adjustment, and the countries that have a surplus and have a fiscal space do not expand, then the overall system is very contractionary. And what we faced from the first two structural adjustment programs, but then in our own structural adjustment program that will come, was that there was no help from Northern Europe expanding their economies to be able to help the countries that were in a crisis and were in a structural adjustment program, Spain, Portugal, Ireland, and Cyprus, to be able to gain competitiveness with the help of an expansionary policy of the North. And the balance of forces in the Eurogroup was, how shall I put this in English terms, not very favorable. Again, there's been a big change here. We now have a progressive governments in Spain and in Portugal. When I was finance minister, both Spain and Portugal in the early period had right-wing governments who were aligned with the northern governments. So the Eurogroup really was Wolfgang Schäuble's court. He had around him not just Holland and the Baltic states, but even Spain and Portugal were completely aligned with this fiscal response, and the idea that Greece had got itself in this problem, and Greece itself should get out of its problem. If you want to discuss later the first memorandum, the first structural adjustment program, and how unfair that was on Greece and how much it helped northern banks rather than Greece, then we can discuss it. And I think the main issue for the northern countries and the popular the parties of the right within Europe was that Syriza should get a bloody nose. the system of the Eurozone and the system of neoliberalism and the emphasis on neoliberal structural reforms had benefited the North, had benefited, in my view, elites both in the North and the South. And if Syriza succeeded, that would open appetites to Podemos in Spain or Bloco in Portugal. So Greece was made an example, so in Voltaire's term, pour encourager les autres, to encourage the others. So you can think of us as a Lord Byng, an Admiral Byng that had to be made an example. And then, of course, the external situation was also dominated by the institutions that responded to, who were accountable to the Eurogroup, to create a framework which was very pro-austerity, very neoliberal reforms. So I'm not going to say much more about the first term, because I think that this was what happened was that the negotiations did not go well. We led to a crisis where we could not accept the last offer of the institutions, which in my view didn't take into account any of the preceding negotiations. We rejected that. We went to the referendum after the which was in favor of or against the proposal of the Troika and the Eurogroup. That was rejected overwhelmingly by the Greek population by about 60-40 in the referendum of early July 2015. And after that, we negotiated a compromise. Now, as you said in your introduction, Kevin, a lot of people said that that compromise was a kolotumba, that it was a somersault to turn the no vote into a yes vote in favor of structural adjustment programs. So the basis of my talk now is to actually discuss whether that criticism is fair and what could be achieved by a left-wing government, and what in fact was achieved, pluses and minuses, of course, as anybody would expect. When we made this compromise, and then we went to the elections of September 2015, it is to our credit, I think, that we were the only government that actually took a structural adjustment program to the electorate. This was not the case either in the first structural adjustment program of PASOK or the second one of PASOK New Democracy. We actually made a compromise and we set it before the people. So when they were voting in the September election of 2015, they had this compromise in favor or against, but they had it in front of them to be able to decide. And our strategy to make the compromise workable is what I've called, and we discussed this, Kevin, between us, the three basket strategy. So I just want to take people through this three basket strategy. So there were three baskets in our approach. The first one, as you can see on the slide, is a large aspect of the structural adjustment program that was agreed with institutions. Now, you can think of this agreed agenda as the Lula strategy. Our strategy was that we must do certain aspects of the structural adjustment program and get them over with, so that we could actually leave the structural adjustment program, and that we should be quite harsh and quite determined to get some things done to be able to move that. It's called the Lula strategy because Lula in Brazil, when he first won the election, said he'd give the first year to the IMF and then the rest of the term would be for him. Now, in the agreed agenda, there were positive things and negative things. They weren't all negative. So there were negative things about the degree of fiscal adjustment, some more pension cuts, not as much as the previous two, but still there were some unfavorable aspects. But there were some very positive things about dealing with non-performing loans, or protecting the state from corruption, dealing with health procurements, making an investment strategy much more transparent and not liable to clientelistic politics. So that was the first basket. The second basket was areas that had been agreed with institutions in principle, but there was a lot of devil in the detail. So there were grey areas. And again, here, as you would expect, we negotiated very hard in the 4 reviews that we had with the institutions. And as people would expect, there were gains and losses. So that, again, some pension cuts I would add to the losses, but some were important gains about the nitty-gritty of the reform. For instance, the IMF, and I don't know if you want to discuss this later, because my view is that the influence of the IMF was pernicious throughout this period. The IMF really was hostile to all kinds of subsidies, child subsidies, health subsidies, and so on. They wanted a general minimum guaranteed income for the poorest of the poor, and all the money that was for social expenditure should go there. It should go there. That is a typical neoliberal view that you shouldn't have subsidies as entitlement in your as citizens, but really they should all be just for the poorest of the poor. And there we managed to both have a housing policy for the first time in Greece and a serious a child poverty program. And the third basket was our own program, which was outside things that we could do, which was not within the remit of the structural adjustment program. So I've given some examples here that Greece did not have a primary health care, and that meant there was great stress on hospitals. We had a rights agenda, sort of for prison reform, for citizenship being given to second generation immigrants. We had laws making marriages of gay rights, at least have a civil contract. And of course, this, I'm sure we won't touch on this, a foreign policy which is very different from previous governments. And one of the crowning achievements of the Syriza government was reaching, finally, after so many years, an agreement with our northern neighbour. Now, of course, from a left-wing perspective, there were many structural adjustments that we would have wanted to do in the economy to not go back to the old development model that we were just so inundated by the third structural adjustment program that we couldn't do. So there is a deficit of important structural changes. We made some, but we could have done more, for instance, in the cooperatives or in the social economy. So let's see successes and failures, defeats and successes. The bottom line, as I write as I've written on the overheads, is that we implemented a structural adjustment program, and a structural adjustment program, even though it was less severe than the previous structural adjustment programs, it is a very severe burden on any government, let alone any government that is within the progressive politics side of the political arena. It's very difficult to do that. The compromise naturally affected our social base. We still had significant support, but it was very difficult, and this is something which needs to be discussed by people who want to learn from Syriza government. It was very difficult after making the compromise for social movements, political parties to actually engage. For a start, they were exhausted. I said before in the previous slide that they tried everything to change the balance of forces in Europe. But also there was a sort of a delegatory predilection that we've tried everything, now it's the government's turn. And one of the lessons of most left-wing politics is that unlike right-wing governments, the left-wing governments, if they succeed, do need an active social support to be able to change the balance of forces, to be able to deal with both the internal opposition and external opposition that I mentioned beforehand. On the other hand, if you had told me in the beginning of when I took over as finance minister in July 2015, that we would have successfully exited the program, that we would have returned to growth, that we would have reduced unemployment by 10 percentage points, that we would have achieved a debt deal which gave us, on the flow side, in other words, how much financial repayments we have to do every year, a clear runway for 10 or 15 years where after 2019, we have less burdensome financial repayments schedules than Portugal, Spain, and Italy. If you had told me we would been able to create a buffer to be able to access the markets, this was a 37 billion buffer. This was the first. Greece has had 3 major bankruptcies in its history, and no government ever before had thought that we need to have a buffer for future contingencies. Of course, we didn't know a pandemic was coming, but you can possibly imagine how dire the state of Greece would be in if we had not had that buffer. And we had important social gains. So we not only the 10 percentage points reduction in unemployment that I mentioned before, but quality to a lower level than before the crisis, let alone after the effects of the first and second structural adjustment program. We reduced poverty. We reduced child poverty very significantly. We increased health expenditure, and also on education. So not a small achievement, but in the end, you could say to me, or people could ask me, but you lost the election in July 2019. So obviously a majority of the Greek population did not feel that you were successful. So I hear that, and maybe we can discuss that. But on the other hand, I would ask people to remember that our vote did not collapse. We went from something like 36% of the percentage vote to something like 31.5%. If you consider PASOK, the government of the center-left that essentially Syriza overtook, it went from 40% to about 5% before recovering to 6, 7, 8%. So we did lose a lot because we implemented a structural adjustment program, but the vote did not collapse because I think enough people, both from the middle class and from the working class and socially excluded people, understood that even under these very difficult circumstances, that the external and internal environment, we did manage to do some of the successes I've indicated. So the million-dollar question: what was it all worth it? I think I'll just repeat what I've just said. That I really do think, if you're going to look at the glass half full rather than half empty, that we managed to not only exit the program, get a debt deal. The reason we rejected the first offer, which led to the referendum in July 2015, was that there was nothing on debt, whereas in the compromise there was something on debt, and we did achieve that at the end. If you had said that, plus all the social gains, I think it would have been worth it. So the decision to actually see if a left-wing government could, A, manage to, in a more humane way, deal with the structural adjustment program, and to leave a structural adjustment program, and C, leave it with some social gain, was very important. And I think that it was worth it for that. We've learned many lessons, which I'm sure you will ask me about what lessons we've learned. And in many ways, many of the things that Syriza brought to the table after 2012, which was seen outrageous by Germany and many other states in 2015, are now being discussed seriously. Yes, this is the fact that you need a fiscal policy, the fact that that the state is important in a crisis, the fact that you should have monetary easing to a great extent. All these are new things. I'm not saying they've happened because of Syriza, that would be absurd, but I think we were raising issues that were very off the agenda in 2012, 2015, 16, which now are at the center of what I would say progressive politics. And I think there will be a huge argument over the next 3 or 4 years with respect to the recovery fund at the European level, of how far there has been an important change, or after the pandemic, slowly there will be a return to politics. But in the end, Kevin, and this is my final remark, was it worth it? I referred to Marx's very famous statement that people make their history, but they don't make it under the circumstances they choose. I think the same is for leftist parties. You know, of course, I would have liked to be a finance minister with 5% growth, 5% unemployment, a European Union that had been convinced that only the state can deal with pandemics and the importance of building primary healthcare. Only the state can intervene at a supranational level to address asymmetries and divergence in the European economies, and so on and so forth. But life's not quite like that. And so all future leftist experiments, which I hope there will be many of them, will face a great deal of problems, not ones that they would have chosen. But I hope that people can consider now that the 2015-19 is a little bit in the past and much more objective, both failures and successes. Thank you very much to everybody for listening to me.
Thank you, FT, very much indeed. If you want to stop sharing the screen, then we can talk directly. That's great. I think there are plenty of questions coming in, but as I said, let's start a discussion, and then we'll bring in as many of the questions as we can. Many of the audience will be not from Greece, and so may be approaching this from a wider international perspective. I know, of course, that Syriza is a party with much internal debate, sophisticated currents of different thought and different strains, etc. I wonder, as a guide to the non-Greeks in the audience, if you could perhaps position yourself in the spectrum of left-right politics within Syriza, however you would describe that. I think you would say that you were to the left of Yanis Varoufakis on many economic issues, but for example, not as left as, say, Lafazanis in terms of coming out of the Eurozone. So I wonder, if you were to position yourself prior to 2015, how would you locate yourself in the many internal currents of Syriza politics?
Well, firstly, we should tell people what Syriza means, because it's an acronym, yes, and that might actually help. So Syriza is the coalition of the radical left. It was an attempt after Maastricht to join, to have an open dialogue, which eventually led to Syriza, of leftists from a lot of currents, from Trotskyists, communists, Euro-communists, left-wing social democrats, people from the environmental movement, who realized that division is not helping us. So we had this sort of slogan that unity is more important than the right line, because without unity of the left, no line matters very much. And just having the line and not having unity, you just can't implement it. So I think you've actually mentioned some of the key aspects of it. Definitely to the left of social democracy. Remember, Syriza starts in the period where social democrats of the Blair, Simitis, Renzi have all but swallowed the whole package of neoliberalism, and it's in their period that huge inequalities actually start rising. So it's definitely on the left of that. It's definitely influenced by the anti-global movement, but it's, or maybe I should put it better, the alter-global movement, because there was a huge discussion within Syriza, given all these currents, to be pro-Europe or anti-Europe, to be for the euro or anti the Europe. And the position that won out was that there are too many issues in the at the European level that are supranational and therefore need supranational solutions. That this is the sort of the more positive way of putting it. I'll just say a word about the negative later. That whether you take economics and dealing with multinationals or financial markets, whether you take the issue of the environment that was growing there, whether you take the issue of tax competition, and whether you take the issue of migration, a large number of issues, we felt that from the experience of the British left in the 70s, the PASOK left in Greece in the 80s, and the French left in the 1980s, that going it alone doesn't work. We also had another fear, that there's one, let me just finish this, Kevin, my last statement. We also had another fear, which is the negative aspect. It is one question whether you should join the euro, but it's a different question if you're in the euro, whether you should leave. Because our fear was, and this is my last statement on this, that if you leave the euro and the euro deconstructs, it will be not under left-wing hegemony, but under very nationalist politics. That was our fear, and it is still our fear. That the breakup of the euro, even though the euro has a lot of problems, could be under the right-wing politics.
Okay. I think I was more interested in where you would position yourself, though, in that spectrum, as it were. So, prior to coming to power, are you on the left of Syriza? How would people describe you within Syriza? And then the next question is, where would people describe you today?
I think prior to the governmental experience, I think people would have positioned me on the left of the pro-European part of the party. So it's not on one axis, it's pro-anti-Europe, and this is crude, of course, because obviously there were sophisticated positions in the middle, and left-right. So I think people would have positioned me on the left of the party, but the pro-European stance. I think now that I feel that with a lot of leftists, we are now, I would consider myself closer to Sanders and Warren than I would to, for instance, Biden. But I think I'm part of that left now, and a lot of Syriza people are part of that left now, that do not really believe that centrist solutions actually work, that there is no hegemonic neoliberal strategy that incorporates enough of the working class and the middle class, as it did in the 90s, to be able to be successful. So we need radical policies, not just because I want to call myself a radical leftist, although I don't mind that title at all. It is because we actually believe that after the economic crisis of 2010 and the growth of inequality before and after that, and now the pandemic, we genuinely believe that strategies of Macron, Renzi, Blair just will not work, and that seems to me on any close reading of the economics and politics of the last 20 years.
Okay, good. In 2016, in the New Left Review, Stathis Kouvalakis wrote a critique of the first year of Syriza in government, and let me just read a few of his comments by way of trying to prompt your reaction to this. He wrote, after the first year of Syriza in power, quote, Syriza won power in January 2015 as an anti-austerity party, the most advanced political opposition so far to the hardening deflationary policies of the Brussels, Berlin, Frankfurt axis. 6 months later, the Tsipras government forced through the harshest austerity package Greece had yet seen. This trajectory was a predictable outcome of the contradiction embodied in Syriza's program: rejects austerity but keep in the euro. That's the danger, he concludes, that the remainder of the radical left faces in Europe now. Sorry, that's the danger that the remainder of the radical left faces in Europe now, after Syriza's failed attempt, the danger of giving up on the very idea of a more radical change. Why is he wrong?
Well, I think he's wrong factually in a number of statements. I don't think any economists or social scientists will look at the three structural adjustment programs and say that the third one was the harshest. I mean, just the degree of fiscal adjustment in the first two, there's no relationship, nor does how much GDP fell, how much taxes increased. I mean, I don't think that's an issue. So I leave that aside. I think that was rhetorical exuberance on the part of Kouvelakis. But the other issue is on that his bottom line is that there is no left-wing politics within Europe.
Within the Eurozone.
Yes. The correction is well. Now, I think in the first structural adjustment program, there was a credible threat that the PASOK government then could have made, that we will not accept a very severe structural adjustment program because what you are offering us is more to save northern banks than to save the Greek economy. And this was accepted by many members of the IMF directorate when the board, when in fact it was put to the board. But 5 years later, when we've lost 25%, what Staffan Kouvelakis does not understand was that if we had left the euro, which I wouldn't support anyway for the reason we said before, we would have had after 4 or 5 years of what we call internal devaluation, in other words, reduction of wages without a devaluation, we would then have faced going to the Greek population and saying, yeah, can we have another 25% decrease in wages? Now, I just don't think that is a strategy for the left. And my final point is that, just to reiterate the one we made before, that the collapse of the euro, I mean, you remember that the Marx said that, no, it was Joan Robinson who said that the only thing worse of being exploited by capital and capitalism is not being exploited by capitalism, because that means you're unemployed. Yeah? I would say that the only thing for a left-wing government not being in the euro, of being in the euro, is not being in the euro, because leaving the euro in a situation that you already lost 25% of your GDP would have made a huge turmoil. And I would remind you of what I put on the slides about the rise of Golden Dawn. This would have been a very serious thing. But I also think it would have been under the hegemony of right-wing politics. It would have been the return of nationalism.
Thanks, that's very helpful. If you were talking to a leftist in the UK or France today, I wonder, when you look back at 2015 and the compromise that you were forced to make, would you feel that makes it harder or easier for the left now to advance an alternative economic strategy?
Well, my view is that if Syriza had chickened out and said, we failed, we couldn't continue doing it, this is a right-wing policies, and it did have a lot of right-wing policies in, as I said, I think that the left in Greece would have reached 4%. So I don't think it had. I don't think there was a viable project of not going for government again in September 2015 and just a jumping ship. I think that would have left very much the situation. And although a lot of left-wing intellectuals did not accept that compromise, there were very many. Your own Paul Mason, for instance, would be a characteristic example. The late, who's also a very good friend, Leo Panich, was very supportive that, you know, the left is not just for good times. Yeah, nobody will vote for the left just because things are going hunky-dory. Yeah, so you have to take those challenge.
So you mentioned being chicken, and I follow your logic. But of course, I guess critics would say that it was chicken to make the compromise and stay in. But I understand.
I have to tell you, it didn't feel like that at the time.
But I guess what you're saying is that, as you have said, to stay in was to make the difficult decisions. But I'm sorry, I've lost the point I was going to make. But that's it. That's it. What I've heard you just say now is that it was the symbolism, in part, of the left being in power, that it would have been much more consequential if the left had been seen to, quote, fail. So better to stay in and make the necessary dirty compromises than to come out and be clean but pure.
And the lesson would have been that the left isn't for the difficult situations. Obviously, the final judgment of whether what I've just said is correct or partly correct depends on how you assess the end of the 4 years. How important was the 10% percentage point decrease in unemployment? How important was the child poverty reduced? How important was that we actually safeguarded future governments with creating a buffer, that having a 10, 15 years leeway, straight runway for debt? Obviously, people can do it, and some people can say it wasn't worth it. So obviously, my reply to the question can't be only the decision in 2015. I've told you why I took the decision, and Alexis Tsipras, of course, took the decision that we had to make it work. But of course, in the end, people have to assess. And I would ask for some leniency in the assessment, given the external factors, the troikas and the German governments and so on.
That's okay. The LSE is many things. We're not a court of law, and there'll be no verdict pronounced at the end. But I wonder if we could just focus briefly on the compromise, and then we can move on to other matters. So, the compromise that you've outlined in 2015, and your critics, of course, would question what the logic of the compromise was in relation to what you expected to be the situation before coming to power. Let me put it in this way. I heard a journalist express it, I thought, rather powerfully at an LSE event. What was it that you learned in 2015 about the need to compromise that you didn't know before coming to power?
I think there are a lot of issues, but let me just say one, which I think is there. We thought we had greater bargaining power because we believed that if they were trying to force a government out of the euro in an attempt to have no compromise between the wills of the 17 eurozone economies and the will of the Greek people that had just been expressed in the politics in the election, if they were not compromised and were actually trying to force us out of the euro, that would have led to the destruction of the euro. Now, I actually believe that is correct. If one country leaves the euro, I think it is very difficult for the eurozone to be feasible, to be sustainable. And the reason is that you, in economic terms, you change effectively a monetary union where there is a cast iron guarantee that no country will ever devalue into a fixed exchange rate system where financial markets take the possibility of devaluation into their accounts. But what we learned was that it doesn't matter what is true. It matters what the opponent, the other side, believes to be true. And I think that you can distinguish here, just naming it and personalizing it is perhaps unfair, but for the sake of shortness, I think Wolfgang Schäuble didn't believe it's true and actually wanted Greece to leave the euro because he is a federalist, but for fewer countries. So he wouldn't perhaps worried that if Greece left, then Portugal would have left and Italy then. And I think by the summer of 2015, after the referendum, Merkel's economic team didn't believe that. They didn't believe Wolfgang Schäuble. So Merkel and at that time Hollande, who was more supportive, said that if Greece leaves, this is going to be very serious. That's why we didn't have as much leverage as we hoped in January 2015, but we did have enough leverage after the referendum in July 2015 to get a better deal than what we put to the referendum that was rejected. So it's a mixed picture.
Okay, that's very helpful. I guess just one brief follow-up on that. Your critics, of course, would say that what wasn't predictable in January 2015 in the election campaign, you were saying they, meaning the Germans and the Eurozone leaders, will back down. Trust me, they will back down. Well, of course, many of your critics were saying in 2014 and also in that election campaign, no, they won't. And they didn't.
I hear you, but how do you create progressive politics? How do you challenge a system like the Eurozone was not working for the South? Don't forget, it's not only Greece that's in a structural adjustment program, but Portugal and Cyprus and Spain and Ireland. If you have everything is given, the financial markets are given, the Eurozone is given, the institutions are given, and nothing can change. Progressive politics has to actually challenge the frontiers of what is possible. And if you don't do that, you might as well become a Blair or a Renzi, which obviously I don't want to do. And I don't think that you can actually challenge the huge income inequalities and wealth inequalities that are now being openly discussed without people trying to challenge the status quo. Because the logical conclusion of your argument, I know it's not your argument, you're just putting it to me, in that sense, your argument is that you shouldn't challenge anything. The powerful are the powerful, financial markets are the financial markets, the Eurozone is Wolfgang Schäuble's court, and so why are you bothering to challenge anything? Well, we're bothering to challenge something because Greece had lost 25% of GDP. It was facing a humanitarian crisis. The hospitals were in a state of almost dissolvement. That's why we had to create some kind of current to challenge. Now, obviously, you can't say beforehand which of your challenges will work and which won't. You don't know, but you have to attempt that.
Okay.
And I'm proud of that. I'm proud of that. I'm not apologetic about that.
I suppose a more systemic, more general question, if I may, then, you mentioned about Wolfgang Schäuble. If I remember correctly, one of his famous comments in January 2015 was, quote, "We don't change policies because of elections." And I wonder if we could build on this and make it a much more general question and not specific to 2015, but more systemically and perhaps looking to the future. You served for many years as a Eurozone finance minister. How do you think we can square this conundrum within the Eurozone between democratic choice in one member state and a shift of policies within the Eurozone leadership? isn't this a system which is just structured to create tensions like this, which are almost impossible to resolve?
I think the question is well taken, and it opens a huge area of discussion. Let me say now in my own country, with New Democracy ruling, that we have a serious democratic deficit. That neoliberal, it doesn't seem to me possible that in a country like Greece and many other countries, you can actually impose neoliberal policies that do not extend some of the benefits as in the past to sections of the working class and middle class without a turn to authoritarianism. The issue here is both one of understanding populism and understanding a democratic response. Because I would say to Wolfgang Schäuble that statement is bread and butter for Le Pen, for Salvini, for Wilders. I mean, if you want to know, if you want to understand populism and how the left needs to understand populism, criticize it, but understand it at the same time, you have to understand people's sense of disempowerment. It's not just that they're unequal. It's not just that they feel they're not making ends. I mean, it's not just that GDP per capita is not increasing. It is that people do not feel that they have the political institutions or techniques of empowerment to challenge that. And that is a time bomb. And the issue of how you respond to that at the national and international level is very important. My own view about, so I don't seem to be avoiding your question, is that I cannot, because I fear the dissolution of Europe and the Eurozone more specifically, I cannot see a response that is not supranational in intention. In other words, Europe needs a European public space, and that is not close to coming at the moment. But I cannot see Europe facing to its challenges, because whatever, I mean, I've been quite favorable to some of the changes in Europe lately about the recovery fund and so on. But even with that, the next 10 years, most economists, I think that this is correct, would predict that the economies of Europe will diverge further between North and South and not converge. That just is not sustainable, either with a single currency or with democratic politics.
Okay, good. Final question from me, and then we're going to go to the questions from the audience. You mentioned about the compromise affecting the social base for Syriza. Let's bring it right up to the present now. Given the experience of Syriza in power, what do you think is the relationship between the party and the protesters? You'd mentioned the protesters in the squares, in the platea, following other international examples. I guess currently we're seeing in many Greek universities protests which have some specific Greek issues at play. But I want to make a more general question as to whether you feel that the legacy of Syriza in power positions it to be a vehicle for those protesters in universities or on the streets, etc.
It's difficult to say, because we're not actually undergoing politics, doing politics in normal conditions. Yes, we've had a year of lockdown with 2 or 3 months in between. So the sort of oxygen of the left, of going on the streets, going into neighborhoods, going into workplaces, discussing with people, has basically been cut off. This government that we have now, New Democracy, has a very strong authoritarian bent. And it has, I think, made a mistake that is going to creating social movements, because what it has done is imposed a lockdown where everybody would have accepted parliamentary activity and action within the lockdown if it's to do with dealing with the pandemic or dealing with economic consequences of the pandemic. But it's not acceptable to not allow people on the streets, not to be able to challenge, because democracy, after all, is not having an election every 4 years. It's a vibrant process of resistance, trying to change the balance of forces. And what they have done is they have implemented very controversial legislation on collective bargaining, removing workers' rights, on bringing armed police into the universities, of various other issues about civil rights, the ability to demonstrate, while not allowing people to demonstrate. Now, this has been counterproductive. It's brought a lot of people onto the streets, people from Syriza, from the Communist Party, from Varoufakis Mera 25, and so on. So it'll be very interesting to see whether what I thought as a problem, that we lost touch with our social base because of this compromise, and people felt, well, what is Syriza doing? Whether we can recover that. New Democracy has been very helpful though on that.
Okay. I'm tempted to ask a follow-up question, but I won't, because there are so many questions coming in. So this is where I attempt to give coherence to the questions coming in. Let me begin with, I guess, a mutual friend, Professor Maria Petmezidou. I read the question directly. Syriza had the opportunity to face key challenges concerning the organizational structure and function of the Greek public health system, particularly by developing public primary healthcare that could be a bulwark against COVID-19 and massively slow the spread of the coronavirus. Why was Syriza's performance so dismal in this respect?
Well, with due respect to the good professor, I think it wasn't dismal. In fact, I would say that was one of our success stories. So roughly speaking, before the first structural adjustment program, public expenditure on health was about 6%. That was reduced to under 5%, 4.8 if I'm in the first two structural adjustments programs. And we brought it, even though we were in the structural adjustment program, we brought it to 5.3%. We did employ a lot more doctors, and this is generally accepted from left and right. And in fact, to be fair to the institutions, even though they were mostly on the neoliberal side, our attempt to bring primary health care was accepted and was passed. We actually instituted law and set up the first primary healthcare clinics that this government, New Democracy, from their election completely ignored. What was absolute. So I honestly think of all the things you can criticize Syriza, that is not. And I think that there's quite a wide acceptance of the state of the health system in January 2015 and where it was in July 2019. Just one final point. We actually included over 1 million people within the national health system who were previously uninsured, who were completely outside. So if you think that we employed more doctors, we started the primary health care system, we insured the uninsured within a structural adjustment program, that I think would be on the plus side.
Okay. I'm going to put two questions together here. There's a question from Kostas Zevas from Liverpool John Moores University. Euclid, he says, do you regret coalescing with the populist right, and did this affect your progressive agenda? Dimitris Papadimitriou asks more specifically, what would have been lost, or what would have been lost had Syriza joined forces with Potami rather than Enel in 2015? Let me simply explain. That is, what would have been lost if Syriza had not formed a coalition government with a nationalist populist right-wing party, but instead coalesced with a new centrist party, Potami, in 2015.
Okay. So the questions are right. In January 2015, you need a majority in Greece, 151 members of parliament, and we had 147 or 8, so very close, but not close enough. And we did ally with the populist right-wing government, populist right-wing party, who were very against the structural adjustment programs and very against the austerity. Now, in actual fact, that alliance did not create a large number of problems in the economic and social field. And it didn't, this surprised me because I was a skeptic, it didn't create that number of problems, even on the democratic agenda, on gay rights and immigrants, which you might have expected. In fact, they sort of passed on those issues and let the majority party have its say on progressive politics, like on gay rights and prison reform and the citizenship to second generation immigrants. So
they were good coalition partners because they were supplicants, but wouldn't Potami have supported those?
Right, yes, I'm coming to that. But of course, the whole alliance collapsed over the issue of Prespes, on the whole issue of our northern neighbor, where they considered this was a sellout of the Macedonian name. I don't think we have time to get into that issue. So that was where the problem was with this right-wing populist party. Now, it sounds logical that we should have gone with the centrist party, but it is part of Greek politics that after the Simitis government of PASOK and after the 2 structural adjustment programs after 2010, the center was very radicalized towards the right. There's a Greek expression now, which is the extreme center. That's what the term we refer to a number of, and they were very, very hostile to Syriza. So on the economic front, they were far closer to the previous government on what I would say the economic social agenda was. That they really had chewed off no, that's not I was trying to translate a Greek expression. They really had taken over a lot of the neoliberal agenda on the economy, and they weren't that friendly to some of even the democratic rights, the rights issues that we wanted to raise. I honestly don't think they actually wanted it. I think even the democratic center were convinced that there would be a left-wing interval. That's why they were so hostile to Syriza. In other words, the Samaras program, let's put a set of minds, a minefield. Syriza will come into power in January, they'll fall in March, and then what Simitis, who have a lot more respect than the ex-prime minister than I do, Kevin, said the government will return to its rightful owners, which suggests some kind of politics there, which is not very progressive.
Okay, thanks. There's a question from Yorgos Palagos in Bremen in Germany. You insist on using the term left. Considering that Syriza implemented the continuation of the neoliberal policy of the previous governments, why do you insist on using the term left and not adopt another title? Do you not agree that this fact offers an invaluable argument to anti-leftist propaganda?
No, because I think that you have to draw a distinction not only about the nature of the third structural adjustment program, but what we try to do. The New Democracy and PASOK in the previous structural adjustment program did not reduce social inequality. They did not reduce child poverty. They did not reduce inequality. The current Minister of Development in Greece, Adonis Georgiadis, who was then a minister in the second adjustment program, structural adjustment program, would go on television and say when they were sacking doctors and university guards, that I'm proud that I'm doing it. I don't want Paul Thompson, who's from the IMF, by the way, taking all the honor. This is what I believe in. So we never had what the institutions and the Eurozone always demanded of us. They demanded that we should take ownership of the program. We never did that. We always said it was imposition, an imposition from the outside. We would do our best, given the compromise, to change its direction. And in certain areas, we succeeded. In certain areas, we didn't succeed. But to say that it's exactly the continuation of the first two structural adjustment programs, I think is just not correct.
Thanks. There are many questions. Let me pick this question here. We're going to a European dimension. Yorgos Karax, LSE alumnus. I'm sorry, this is from Charlie Mansell in the United States. Syriza is currently polling 25 to 28% and is 15% behind in the polls, whilst Podemos, though in government, has seen its vote share drop too. And the Dutch elections also saw a drop in all the left parties' votes. And this is going to be difficult to pronounce. Should Podemosization, Syrizization, join PASOKification as a term we should also use for current left vote share decline?
Look, the figures the questioner asks are roughly right. We are lagging in the polls. There is definitely, after the pandemic, a conservative turn in politics. And it always happens when fear is dominant. So I think there is a problem of right-wing politics dominating in certain aspects and trying to elicit more authoritarian, more conservative responses amongst the population. But I don't think that the left can recover the hegemony by just saying that it never will form a government, that it's not interested in power. I think you have to find a beau milieu between seeking government and seeing how you can align with social forces that can exploit another current, which is at the same time a result of the pandemic. Because I think a lot of people in this pandemic are re-examining a number of things that they thought important. The importance of the national health system, the importance of health with respect to other, having the new mobile. They're readdressing the issue of the state and the state involvement. All those lectures I used to have as a finance minister, that the state can't sort this out and the state can't sort that out, that is changing. So at the same time that there is a conservative shift due to fear and the exploitation of right-wing and not so right-wing governments of fears about the stranger, the immigrant, the young people, and so on, there is another shift going on, which is saying that what we were told in 20, 30 years of neoliberalism is not right. It isn't true that everything private is good in the health system, for instance, and everything that public is bad. It isn't true that the government can't intervene in times of recession. So it's up to us leftists and left-wing parties to be able to enhance the second tendency and minimize the first.
Thank you. So there's a question from Emmanuel Korakakis, which is very much in terms of your strategy in 2015. The February-June confrontation led to a bank run. Had you applied a wedge, say 10% in outflow of funds from the Greek banks, and introduced a fiduciary deposit accounts for Greek bank depositors, businesses, as we had applied in Cyprus after the bail-in, you would have definitely avoided the bank run and the sentiments of a bail-in. That would have bought you time for a more efficient negotiation with a better outcome. can you explain why you didn't?
It is definitely the case that the Syriza government looked at some of the issues that the questioner asked, but other issues about extending the time and giving us more time. But the bottom line is that the Schäuble and the Eurozone was quite committed to us leaving the Eurozone. So the time was not on our side. There were a lot of pressures after May, June, and we were hampered by the fact that in January, we started with empty coffers, and it was amazing how well informed both governments and the institutions were about how empty the coffers were. They had online, real-time information on that. And I honestly don't believe that there was any one strategy that could have extended the time for negotiations more than was available.
Okay, there's a question here which is really about, as it says, the Varoufakis strategy. Looking at GDP development from 2009 onwards, we can see it going up and tending to turn positive. But from 2015 onwards, it turns negative again for some years. Varoufakis' and Syriza's gamble to, quote, blackmail the EU with declaring bankruptcy led to that. Was it worth it? Or with sacrificing some of the ideology to achieve the least worst outcome being a better choice?
Well, the bottom line is, in the first two structural adjustment programs, GDP fell by 25%. So from 10 to 15. From 15 to 19, overall, there is a growth, anemic growth. Now, that all assumes that if the elections had been won by the right wing, they would have continued their growth to increase. And I would ask the questioner, why didn't they finish the fifth review of the program in the summer of 2015? If things were so well, even with 27% unemployment, even with banks having a lot of non-repayable loans and so on, why did the Samaras government close the fifth review, extend the program, get out of the program, perhaps with a credit line? Why didn't it do it? It was because they had reached the end of their possible response to the economy. They had reached an end to their ability to be able to manage. And the summer of 2014, they jumped ship, essentially, not closing the fifth review.
Okay. A question from Paul Kidner. It is surely true that the EU and the IMF were initially antagonistic, but was this also because they saw a populist government that had pushed for radical change after agreements had already been made, whilst promising to rip up those same memorandums? Would you agree that Syriza finally managed to agree a memorandum of understanding when it matured and started to work with the EU rather than against it? And if so, would you accept that in the meantime, unfortunately, real and lasting damage to society and the economy was made despite the debt deal? If so, would you accept that in the meantime, unfortunately, real and lasting damage to society and the economy was made?
I'm not sure that the purpose of the question. Of course, I accept that both the IMF in particular, but other institutions, wanted to prevent as much as possible a radical alternative to the status quo in Europe and in Greece. That's given. Of course, that's what they wanted to do. The issue is whether a left-wing government with a popular vote has the right in Europe, as we understand it, to challenge that. That's an important democratic question, let alone a social, political economy question. Now, if we have that right, then obviously we will have a strategy which will have, as I've tried as honestly as I can in my presentation, successes and failures. But I do not accept that we were school children, which that is the focus of the good Europeans and the IMF had to educate us in the ways of Europe, because there are clearly, and now accepted even more by many people, there were very clear problems with the way Europe was doing business at that time. And I have to say that and if we had more time, maybe you should invite me to give a talk on the IMF and the structural adjustment programs, Kevin, because I have a lot to say about that. The IMF, right to the end, was trying to get its full neoliberal agenda, cutting further than we already had 13 at least reductions in pensions in the first structural adjustment program. And Paul Thompson was still committed to greater reductions in pensions, and was actually pressurizing Greece and not accepting the figures that were accepted by Greece and by the European institutions about our performance in fiscal policy in order to impose his agenda. And his agenda, I have to tell you, had nothing to do with Christine Lagarde's statement about social inclusion, about the importance of women, importance of reduction in poverty. The IMF people on the ground were as neoliberal as the best neoliberal could possibly wish for.
Okay. There's a couple of questions which we'll combine, which is about today and universities. There's a question from Michael Hellenic from the Goethe University in Frankfurt. Thanks for the presentation. How would you assess the effects that Syriza had on the functioning of Greek public universities? And then I think there's another question. Yes. If policing schools is wrong, then what is your answer to the massive lawlessness that exists in Greek universities? Also, if extreme policing can suppress freedom of speech, which it does, and this should be regulated, would you argue that the current conditions allow for freedom of speech? So there's lots of questions there, but first perhaps you could simply say, what did Syriza do for public universities in Greece? And today, what aspects of the protests in Greek public universities would you not agree with? This is against the background, of course, that we've seen these last few months, protests which have humiliated the rector of your former university, the Athens University of Economics and Business. Long term, we've seen much vandalism and criminality on Greek university campuses. So something's got to be done. What should be done, which would be effective and acceptable?
Well, the first thing that shouldn't have been done in the second structural adjustment program is actually fire guards, not police, but guards who were actually doing a job of safeguarding the universities. So let's put that in the context of the second adjustment program.
But you wouldn't say that before, whenever 2012, you wouldn't say that the order in Greek public universities was hunky-dory.
I definitely challenge both the premise of your question and the premise of the question. The idea that the Greek universities are rife with violence, illegality is just not true. It just isn't true. There are problems in certain universities, but most Greek universities do not have such a problem. And of course, most people who oppose, who come from the standpoint I'm hearing these questions, actually are not just interested in reducing important pockets of violence, I accept, and disorder, but they actually want to change the nature of Greek universities, where there have been important occupations about very important issues about how much money is given to universities, what is the ratio between teachers and students, about the nature of courses. So I think it's very important that a lot of people who have this agenda that Greek universities are full of violence and strife and so on, have an agenda which is, frankly, to challenge very important liberties that have historically been important in Greece. And I remind you, every country has its own rights and its own history of that. In Greece, it was the students of the National Technical University and the law school that brought down the junta. That history is symbolically very important in Greece, and it's very important also to very many European students and university professors that I've spoken to. We have that current of radicalism, and I honestly believe that although there are problems that can be addressed about enlightened minorities who think they can impose their will on others, and so in this area we would agree, Kevin, but there is also another current which is very important about resistance. And I just do not believe that the response of this government to have armed police, we already have the biggest percentage of policemen, together with Cyprus, in the whole of Europe. The government is now imposing proposing to employ another 1,000 armed policemen within the universities. If you think that is going to sort out the problem of Greek universities, I really think that we are very far apart from this. I think Syriza did a lot for university education. It did things to do about courses for students from poorer areas. It tried to introduce 2-year courses for intermediate between university and technical training. It tried to conglomerate some universities with technical colleges. Perhaps it didn't do enough, and I don't think it did as much as in health. That's why I disagreed with Professor Venizelos' question at the start. But definitely, I think it did have a policy for education, which is worth examining.
Okay, I'm going to squeeze in 2 more questions. So if I could just ask you to be brief on these 2, please. So the question from Rodolphus Maslias from UCL. Should Syriza have done more to address clientelism in public administration and Greek society? And how an important priority for Syriza in the future is that?
In this area, I think we really did try to have a break with previous governments. So we had both the reform of the public administration. We had in many ministries important reforms to protect for instance, the way investment grants are given or public procurements in health are given, to make them online together with a transparent way. Even in the social area, who gets what benefit was completely transparent with platforms. All these were very important interventions in changing the clientelistic politics. I have to say, one of the most disappointing things about the new government, New Democracy, is how we've had a straight rerun as if nothing has happened. Clientelistic politics, I have to say, are alive and well in the Greece of Konstantinos, of Kyriakos Mitsotakis, to the extent that the party boss of Preveza, which is my hometown, is now the head of the hospital in Arta, the neighboring region, and the party boss of Arta is head of the hospital in Preveza. I mean, we really have, this has been most disappointing, even for somebody like me who's anti-neoliberal and has few expectations of this government. The fact that it has been so cavalier in clientelistic politics is actually shocking.
Okay, last question, and we can give you a full 2 minutes to answer this, clearly. Some on the left in Greece argue about what we would call a big tent politics. That is, that Syriza should open up to the centre left, and that is a strategy going forward. It's a strategy which has been associated with Alexis Tsipras in recent times as well. What would your position be at the moment in terms of Syriza and its more moderate left-wing parties in terms of trying to achieve its objectives in the coming period? And if there was an election for the party leadership of Syriza this year, Are you going to be a candidate?
Okay, let me answer that in the end. My view on alliances is as follows. I think the present government is failing in so many ways, in the health system, in the economy, in the return of clientelistic politics, that I genuinely believe that Syriza should be open to alliances with other leftists and centrist parties to challenge both the neoliberal direction and the clientelistic politics of this government. Number one. Number two, I also firmly believe that the Syriza as party should appeal to all sorts of people on its left, on its right, so sort of both to centrist voters geographically, politically, geography, I mean, and to its left. But that is not the same as proposing centrist policies. What I said at the beginning, I firmly believe. The kind of politics, if centrist politics is the kind of politics of Blair and Renzi Simitis, that is not a basis for creating a new hegemonic political project. It doesn't address inequality. It doesn't address the environment. It doesn't address many of the issues that people should be concerned about.
So big tent politics, there's no difference between yourself and Alexis Tsipras in terms of the strategy going forward?
No, I don't think so. I think we both, I think the term that we've used is radical realism. You need radical policies that which compromise, consist of a break, both with the structural adjustment programs and with the pre-crisis years of neoliberalism, but at the same time take into account some of the external and internal constraints, and that's why I call it radical realism. And I think that
are there any circumstances in which you could envisage yourself putting forward as leader of the Syriza party?
I think you firstly are making a mistake of the age gap between myself and Alexis. So Alexis is a much younger politician than I am. I still think he's got quite a big future ahead. I don't think anybody should be holding their breath on him retiring from politics any time soon. And I also think that by the time he thinks he's finished the cycle, his cycle, I think that Syriza have a lot of younger people coming through the ranks who will replace him in that eventuality.
Okay.
I think that
we're coming to an end. Let me simply say that you're both much younger than me anyway. But let me, first of all, remind everyone that the recording of this discussion will be available as a podcast on the website of the Hellenic Observatory at the LSE. It will also be available for the YouTube channel of the Hellenic Observatory. Can I mention that our next Hellenic Observatory event is part of a series which would normally take place in Athens, and that is by a professor of economics here at the LSE, Oriana Bandera, who is the Sir Anthony Atkinson Chair in Economics at the LSE. And the title of her talk is Inequality, the Misallocation of Talent and Economic Development. And that will take place online, of course, on the 15th of April, UK time 4 o'clock, Greek time 6 p.m. And that is a series of lectures which the Hellenic Observatory has. For Oriana Bandera's lecture, we will have two discussants. Eleftherios Hatsis, Professor of Philosophy at the University of Athens, and Daphne Nikolitsas of the Department of Economics at the University of Crete. So let me first of all thank my colleagues in the Hellenic Observatory for their support, and the LSE events team, very professional as always. But to finish, let me give a very warm thanks to our speaker, Euclid Tsakalotos, for coming and joining us and speaking so clearly and so informatively on the experience of the left in power in Greece, and for answering so many diverse questions. You can see on the screen that if you want more information about the program public activities of the Hellenic Observatory, please visit our website. But again, thank you, Euclid, and thank you to everyone for watching, and we look forward to more discussions in the future. Thank you, bye.